we looked at Christian views of Romans and then Roman views of Christians. This sets up our conversation about persecution and martyrdom. What were the circumstances that allowed the Romans to decide that arresting, beating, torturing, even killing Christians was an acceptable or even a desirable course of action? So the next two lectures we're going to be talking about persecution and martyrdom, and then we'll begin looking at some particular martyrdom stories. So this is just by way of review. We have all these categories that we talked about in the last lecture. Christians being secretive and bad for business, and a slave religion, and cannibals, and eating the blood of and drinking the blood of babies, and eating their flesh, and being unpatriotic, not honoring the gods, and being ultimately the source of problems. Given all these prejudices against Christians, there's a circumstance in which Christians are viewed as different and sometimes threats. So they're subject to attempts to suppress them. The Romans were many things. And one thing about the Romans is if they saw a potential threat, they did not hesitate to act. The Romans were not known for their mercy. They were very good engineers, they were very good in the military, and if they saw a threat, they used whatever means necessary to eliminate the threat, to keep their power. And using violence was no problem for the Romans. They had no hesitation about using violence if necessary. Now, talking about persecution and martyrdom in early Christianity, we need to keep in mind that most of this occurred sporadically and locally. In very few cases, we will talk about these cases, but in very few cases was a persecution organized. Was it empire-wide? In most cases, these are like local mobs that seem to rise up. Or for some reason we don't know, all of a sudden a particular local leader will begin to enforce some laws in a very rigorous way. Within Christianity, there has been the view in the past that for the first 300 years, Christians were always persecuted everywhere all the time. And the history shows us that was not the case. Christians weren't persecuted constantly and everywhere, but they were persecuted in certain places and certain times. And even the early imperial persecutions seem to be primarily local. In a later period, with the Great Persecution, we will see by Diocletian an attempt to have a broader persecution to include everywhere. But early on, even when the emperor gets involved with these persecutions, it appears to be local. In one particular example, is the case of Nero. Nero's persecution of the Christians in Rome, which occurred after the fire of the year 64. So here we have the Emperor Nero involved in persecution, but it seems to be localized. There are two Roman historians who tell us about what happens after the fire and how Nero becomes involved in the persecution of Christians. So we're going to look at these Roman sources in a little bit of detail here to see what they say. So the context is, in the year 64, a large fire breaks out in Rome. And it burns a large part of the city. Now, it just happened to be that the Emperor Nero, who was hated by many of the Romans already because he was a crazy person. The Romans say this, he was crazy. He was horribly ruthless and violent and irrational and did things as the emperor that even other Romans thought were despicable. He was famous for sexual debauchery and all kinds of horrific things that he would do. So the Romans did not like Nero. Nero wanted to build a new house. He wanted to build a new palace. But he couldn't build the palace where he wanted to build it because people lived there. Well, all of a sudden, on some night in the year 64, a huge fire breaks out and burns down the very part of the city where he was hoping to build his palace. You can still go to Rome today and visit what's called the Golden Palace of Nero. That's the house Nero wanted to build. Well, once these houses were all burned down, the emperor could go in, level the houses, clear the land, and build his own house there. So very early on, other Romans were suspicious of this. They knew what Nero wanted to do, and all of a sudden a fire burns down that exact part of the city. Everyone is suspicious of Nero. So the Roman historian Tacitus, in his annals, in his history, tells us, but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and all the propitiations of the gods, so everything he was trying to do to distract people. He was trying to buy people off with bribes. He was trying to invoke the gods and goddesses. He was trying to do anything he could to convince people that he had not set the fire. But all this did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration, the fire, was the result of an order. So no matter what Nero did, no matter how he tried to, in the ancient terms, manipulate the media to get his message out, no one believed that he did not set the fire. Everyone knew what he'd done. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. In the ancient world, like today, if a politician gets caught doing something they shouldn't be doing, one of the first things they will do is try to blame someone else. This is what Nero does. Everyone thinks he set the fire. He says, finally, no, it was the Christians. Why? Because people already hate the Christians. They already hate the Christians, so they're an easy target. He begins to blame the Christians. Tacitus goes on to tell us more. Christus, this is Christ in Latin, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators or governors, Pontius Pilate. So their leader suffered the extreme penalty. He was killed at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So in Judea, under Pontius Pilate, this hideous superstition, this belief in Christ had first cropped up. And Pontius Pilate killed Jesus to try to suppress it. But it showed up again. First in Judea, and now in Rome. And the important word here is superstition. That Romans over and over again refer to Christianity and even Judaism as a superstition. And superstition in Latin, superstitio is the word, is a very dangerous term. It's the word that's used for sorcerers. Sorcerers in the ancient world, in the Roman context, could be killed for being sorcerers. So superstition was a dangerous thing. It threatened to break the equilibrium with the gods. So Christianity is dangerous because it's a superstition. And so Nero goes after these Christians, blames them for the fire, and then begins to punish them. Accordingly, so therefore, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. So anyone who said, I am a Christian, was arrested first. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted. So the first Christians were arrested. They were tortured to get information. That information was used to arrest more Christians. They were convicted not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. So what were they guilty of? Well, not really setting fire to the city, it's they hated him. Why did they hate mankind? Because they refused to worship the gods. They refused to honor the gods. They broke the equilibrium with the gods. They threatened social order. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. So how did they kill the Christians? Some of them were torn apart by wild beasts, some of them were crucified, and some of them were burned alive. Tradition says that Peter died in Rome during this persecution, and so it's possible that Peter falls in the category of those who were nailed to a cross. But notice they're burned alive to serve as nightly illumination in the city. So as you're Well, let's go on. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. So the gardens, the public gardens at night were lit up by the bodies of burning Christians. Hence, even for criminals, the Christians, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion. For it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. So these Christians, because they were Christians, they were already criminals. They deserved horrible punishment, but even Nero may have gone too far with what he did. The other Roman historian who talks about this same event, Suetonius, in his Life of Nero, says, during his reign, Nero's reign, many abuses were severely punished and put down. And no fewer new laws were made. A limit was set to expenditures. The public banquets were confined to a distribution of food. He goes on and talks about other things that happened during the reign of Nero. Then he mentions here briefly, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. So Nero punished these Christians because of their superstition. So both Tacitus and Suetonius give us a picture of bias and hatred toward Christians, although no one really seems to know why. What did the Christians actually do? No one thought the Christians actually set the fire in the city, so why were they being punished? They were being punished because people already thought they were guilty. People already thought they were guilty of a superstition. They were already a danger to the empire. So it seems that just being called a Christian was enough for people to consider them criminals. Now, this is not, or should not have been, a surprise to Christians. Because if we look at the letter of 1 Peter, 1 Peter says, if you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed. For the Spirit of glory and of God rest on you. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or thief or any other kind of criminal or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. So 1 Peter talks about being insulted because of the name Christian. And we see in Tacitus the name. They're called Christians. 1 Peter talks about being persecuted because you're called a Christian. And Tacitus says people hated these people even if they didn't know anything else about them because they had the name Christian. Another Roman source also talks about being persecuted just because of the name Christian. This is a letter written from Pliny, who was a governor in the Black Sea region, to the Emperor Trajan. And he's talking about what happens with these Christians. How do I deal with these Christians? The problem of the Christians. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I've observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. So first of all, I tortured them. This is what interrogation means in the Roman world. It means torture. I tortured them to see if they really were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated, that is, tortured, a second and third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. So what is the crime? They're executed here simply because they say, yes, I'm a Christian. They haven't done anything else. There's no other crime attached to them. But just being called a Christian, the name Christian, is enough. If they continue to say, yes, I'm a Christian, they're executed. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserve to be punished. So some strange vocabulary here at the end. I don't know what they believe, but the fact is I've asked them to give up their belief and they won't do it. That's enough reasons for them to be punished. I'm punishing them because they're called Christians and because they refuse to change their ways. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. Now notice here, people who are called Christians but are Roman citizens are dealt with differently. And if we think back to the New Testament, to the case of Paul, Paul is over in Caesarea, is being tried, but he's a Roman citizen. He has different rights. And so Paul himself actually appeals to Rome and is sent to Rome for his trial. And we see in a later period other Christians also going through the same thing, where they're sent to Rome for the final decision. But just being called a Christian, as 1 Peter said, you may be persecuted just for being called a Christian, even if no one knows what that really means. We've seen all the prejudices that people had, and we have to imagine that many people living in cities and towns knew Christians and knew that Christians didn't actually kill babies. They must have known that I don't think this is actually happening. But the name itself, Christian, identifying yourself as a Christian becomes enough to be punished. And we will see in some of the martyrdom accounts that at critical points the governors will question the martyrs, and the martyrs will say, I am a Christian. And that's the language that they use over and over again, and that is enough to justify punishment. Let's talk about a few famous martyrs, famous early martyrs killed by Roman authorities. This is just a small sample size, and we'll come back and talk about some of these in more detail. Obviously, Jesus was killed by the Roman authorities. And probably the two most famous Christian martyrs are Peter and Paul. And according to tradition, both Peter and Paul were killed in Rome by Nero, perhaps between the years 64 and 68. This is the tradition. The sources are a little more complicated on this, a little less clear, but this is certainly the dominant tradition. And I'll just pause for a moment and make a little statement about something that I've worked on. I've just published a book that came out within the last month or so that's called The Ancient Martyrdom Accounts of Peter and Paul. And in this book, I've translated and I have some commentary on more than a dozen different ancient accounts of the deaths of Peter and Paul. And if we look at these accounts, we find some similarities and some differences. Some of these accounts have Peter and Paul dying separately. Some of them specifically have Peter and Paul dying together. So there are lots of different details we get in these different accounts of Peter and Paul. But there's no question that in the Christian tradition, while Stephen is considered the first martyr, the proto-martyr, Peter and Paul are probably the two most important martyrs in Christianity. Let's look at some others, and here's kind of a long list we're just going to talk about quickly. We've talked before in the class about Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, who's killed around the year 110. Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, killed around the year 160. And I'm just giving you a sampling here. This is, I guess, don't worry about too much of the details, just kind of see the flow of things here. In southern France, in Lyon and Vienne, around the year 177, there's the death of Blandina, a young woman, and many others killed along with her. Blandina is subjected to multiple attempts to kill her before she's actually killed. We're going to talk about the martyrs killed in Scilium, in Africa. Actually, finally killed in Carthage around the year 180. We'll be talking about them. Perpetua and Felicity, along with some others, also killed in Carthage around the year 202 or perhaps 203. And we'll be coming back to talk about them as well. So several of these martyrs here, in the case of Ignatius and Polycarp, are bishops. But these other martyrs we have here, Blandina and the others, the martyrs in Scilium, Perpetua and Felicity, these are not bishops. These are just people. Some of them may have been priests, perhaps, but we don't have any indication that they're all bishops. However, we do know, not just in the case of Ignatius and Polycarp, we do know from some other evidence that bishops at certain points were targeted. So if we look at the 3rd century in Rome and think, what's the most dangerous job in Rome in the 3rd century? It appears to be being the bishop of Rome. So let's just look at this list. Callistus, the bishop of Rome, martyred in 222. Urban I, martyred in 230. Fabian, martyred in 250. Cornelius, martyred in 253. Sixtus II, martyred in 258. And then the last item in the list here, the famous North African martyr, the bishop Cyprian, also killed in 258. So there are a lot of martyrs here, and many more in this period we haven't talked about. But we're still looking at sporadic, local persecutions. They could be very intense, but it's not constant and it's not everywhere. And certain cities like Rome and like Carthage are helpful for us because there's more literary evidence to give us more evidence, more information on what's happening in these persecutions. So in the next lecture, we're going to come back and talk more about persecution and martyrdom. But this sets up some of the general framework. How does this come about? What are some examples of some of the important early persecutions and martyrdoms that we see? Yeah, so the question is about the word local and localized martyrdoms. And the case of Pliny, let's go back to that slide, to this letter. Pliny's letter to Trajan, is he initiating this? Is Pliny initiating this? Is that what's indicated by the letter? So the word local is to distinguish from, I think the idea that I grew up hearing was that Christians everywhere always are persecuted. And we just don't have the evidence. So when Nero is killing Christians in Rome, we have no evidence that he's also killing them in Carthage, or that he's also killing them in Corinth or anywhere else. He seems to be focused on Rome. And Pliny is writing to Trajan. He seems to want some kind of general policy. And if we look at the letters carefully, it's not clear that Trajan has a general policy. But also in your question, you mentioned that he seems to tell Pliny to slow down. It appears that he's making up some policy as he goes along. What he seems to be concerned about is, he's not concerned that Christians are being killed. Trajan seems to be concerned about how people are being denounced as Christians. So he says to Pliny, be very careful about how you know if they are Christians or not. Is this a general imperial policy? It doesn't appear that Trajan has exactly thought through all the details until Pliny says, here's a case. What do I do in this case? Which is also an indication that maybe these persecutions and the policies are being, in some ways, developed on the fly. And Trajan's saying, okay, Trajan doesn't say stop killing Christians. He says, be careful that people aren't just turning in someone else because they hate them. This is the danger. If the imperial government will kill someone for being a Christian, and you want someone's land, then you say, oh, they're a Christian. The government kills them, you get their land. Or that's the danger that the Trajan seems to have in mind. But yeah, he's telling Pliny, be more careful, but he doesn't tell him to stop killing Christians. So he still sees the Christians as a threat, but he also sees the potential threat of people using that as a way to solve their other problems or to fight their other battles with people.